on the right.
Yeah.
From our perspective, looking out.
So I'm like the American flag. I'm on the right.
Yeah.
Okay. Good morning, everyone. Are we all set, Mike? Okay, good. So we'll get started a few minutes late here. I'm sorry about that. My name is John Marion. I think I know some of you, but not all of you. I run Common Cause Rhode Island. I just want to thank you all for coming out this morning. I have as you always do, you have some other thank yous to give. We need to thank RISD. RISD actually provides this room to us at no cost. Specifically Babette Alina, who's not here today, who works in their government relations office, as well as Pamela Kimmel, who runs this auditorium for the museum. So we want to thank them for the room. I also want to thank a couple of people at Common Cause. Many of you met Christina Mora when you signed in, who helped organize the event. Colin Murphy, our board president, who produced the materials that you got in your packet. And Eric Anderson, who's also outside helping sign people in. Finally, I want to thank the panelists for taking a little time out of their weekend. I know in particular Ian has been on several panels this week. It must be panel week. But in the legislators who are in session, so thanks for taking a Saturday morning to come out and help us. So we've started this last year. We started a series of programs we call Demystifying Democracy. We've come to realize as an organization over the years that a lot of people don't understand how our legislature works and how the legislative process works. And our goal is to demystify it so that not only do you understand it, but you can get involved. We have a series of 3 panels that we think are very complementary with each other over a 4-month period. To help people understand the legislative process. You should have gotten actually a handout. If you didn't get one, you can get one on the way out that has all those events. The next one is in March and deals with how you can testify if you want to up at the legislature. And the last one is at the beginning of May, which is about one very specific thing at the Assembly, which is how the state budget works, which is a timely topic to raise this week because the governor unveiled her budget. So I hope you can join us for the other ones. We're also recording these and we'll put them online. And so if you are gonna have to step out early, or if you wanna review anything you saw today, or if you know people who couldn't come and might be interested in hearing the program, they can watch them on our website. We've also included for you a packet of materials, including the colored sheets, which I mentioned were created in part with the help of Colin Murphy. They include some things that we thought might be helpful for people trying to understand the legislative process. One is a glossary of terminology, because there's a lot of specialized terminology. The second is a timeline of when things happen during the year and when things happen during the day. A third thing is a map, and there's a funny story about the map. You cannot go to the State House and get a map. They won't give you one for security reasons. So we just made one. And I was in a executive office up at the State House, one of the executive officers, and there was the map on the wall. And they were like, we've always wanted a map, but we couldn't get one. So there's a very valuable, evidently, map. There's a little sheet about how to track legislation, if you're interested in the bill. And finally, a checklist, if you're gonna go up there, sort of the things you need to know and need to bring and need to plan for. So I hope you'll find this useful. Again, these are on our website, and you can download more copies if you want to. We hope to add additional materials to this as the years go by and make it more comprehensive. So if you have any feedback, if you think there's other topics we should be covering, please let us know. Our phone numbers and emails are all over these materials. And I want to point out a couple more things before we get started. One is we also included in the packet we're not going to be talking about Common Cause's work today, but we do work at the legislature on a variety of topics. We included a copy of our agenda for the year, and we will be having an event on that in February. And then also I just want to thank the June Rockwell Levy Foundation, which provides funding for us to do educational programming like this. So now, after all the thank yous and introductions, I just want to introduce briefly the panelists. We're going to use all the left-right jokes that come with politics. On my left, on his right, is Representative Michael Chippendale, a 4-term representative, if I counted it correctly last night. Next to him is Representative Shelby Maldonado, who is a 2-term representative. Then we have Ian Donis, who is a political reporter for Rhode Island Public Radio, and Eugenia Marks, who retired not too long ago from the Audubon Society and was their chief lobbyist and played other roles there. I will, if you want to introduce yourself a little bit more, say where you represent or whatever, you're more than welcome to.
Sure. Again, I'm Michael Chippendale from District 40, which is the entire town of Foster, most of Gloucester, and the western portion of Coventry. So I have the sticks, the farm part of the state in my district. As John pointed out, I've been serving since being elected in 2010. It's a great honor and it's a great privilege, and it's absolutely something that I will love to continue to do as long as the people continue to see fit to send me back there.
Great. Thank you.
Thank you, everyone, for joining us today. My name is Shelby Maldonado. I represent the city of Central Falls, 1 square mile city, also known as the Comeback City. And this is my 2nd term, and hopefully I continue to serve them in the coming term as well.
I'm Ian Donis, political reporter for Rhode Island Public Radio. I came to Rhode Island in April 1999 to work for the now defunct Providence Phoenix. 2 weeks later, the FBI raided City Hall, so I knew I was in a great place to be a political reporter. I've been at Rhode Island Public Radio since 2009. I spend a lot of time at the legislature during the course of the year. I'm not there every day. The legislature is a very top-down process. The Speaker and Senate President have a lot of control over what happens. But so I try to, there are important pieces of legislation to follow. I do report on the state budget, which the legislature ultimately changes and approves. But I also try and pull back and look at other kind of less attention-getting stories at the legislature that deserve attention, or what are some of the consequences of legislation. And but a lot of people don't realize how much power the General Assembly has. They tend to focus more on the governor or Rhode Island's U.S. senators, but the legislature does really control the budget. It can pass laws that have a dramatic effect on the lives of Rhode Islanders. So I think it's very important to keep an eye on the legislature.
Great. Thanks. And Eugenia.
Good morning. Great to see so many familiar faces, and know a lot of you already work up at the State House. I started with the Audubon Society in 1980-81, had some populist activity as a civil rights worker in the 1960s in North Carolina, but then went through a hiatus, was involved with Audubon because I moved here in 1972 and started my career again in the 1980s, and found work at the State House at first intimidating, but finding my way around and finding key people to talk to, understanding that the way we learned in Civics 101 is not the way the government works, has been gratifying in the sense that we have passed environmental legislation over the years that was beneficial to the public good.
Thanks. And I think one of your last points there is really why we're here today. So the title of the panel, or the program, is I'm Just a Bill Held for Further Study, and it's taken from that Schoolhouse Rock video that is Civics 101. That a constituent has an idea, and they go to their legislator, and that legislator gets it written up as a bill, and lo and behold, it gets signed into a law. And that's not how it always happens. And so what we're trying to kind of get to today is how do things really happen in Rhode Island, and how can you be involved in that? And so the format is just, I'm going to ask some questions of the panelists based on their respective backgrounds. And then if we have enough time, we'll take some questions for the panelists from the audience. We're going to try to end in about an hour. We're going to end a little bit early because there's some folks with signs who want to go up to the State House and others. So we're also going to have some coffee for you as you head out into the winter day to make your voice heard. So let me start with Shelby. Can you explain some of the basics of the assembly? You know, how many people are there? How long? You both said you want to continue to serve. How long do you get to serve for, that sort of thing?
Okay. So generally, how it works is you have the Senate and then you have the House. I represent the House. There's about 75 members on the House side, roughly about 12 Republicans, the remaining Democrats, and I believe we don't have an independent at this point. On the Senate side, there are about 38 members, several Republicans, Democratic side the majority, and then typically what happens is you serve every 2 years. So we are up for elections every 2 years. For example, this year is an election year. So we'll have our campaigns over the summer. Come November, if you do have a general, you'll be on the ballot in November. And then you will serve again for the next 2 terms. Where you don't have an election, we call that the off-season or off-term. So then essentially, that's pretty much what you're looking at when you come into the General Assembly, basics of that.
Yep. Yeah, great.
Yeah.
So you're like members of Congress, you're running every 2 years, but
Every 2 years.
the upper chamber doesn't get the nice 6-year terms like the U.S. Senate.
No, and just keep in mind, there's no term, it's unlimited. So you can pretty much run every 2 years for the next 15 years if you are, that great representative or senator that your community would like to see up there.
And I believe,
So no term.
was it Brian Patrick Kennedy just celebrated some sort of milestone?
30 years.
30 years, so he's served. So if you can keep getting reelected, you can keep serving on and on. So Mike, so that's sort of the broad outline of the assembly. Can you walk us through briefly sort of the flow of legislation through that?
Sure, and something I forgot in the bio was I was an activist for 6 years prior to being a legislator, so I thought I knew everything about the process. I really did. And when I got elected, I was completely surprised that I had absolutely no idea of how things worked. So from the perspective of a member of the minority party, and again, there's 11 of us in a body of 75, things operate differently for us than would the majority. Makes sense. So I don't anticipate a process that is going to facilitate me achieving legislative goals, but for on the rare occasions. I mostly am a voice of opposition. I am the conscience of the two parties. That's our role. Our role is to just be to point out alternatives to what we may believe are flawed policies or policies that could be better. We do introduce legislation. I do introduce legislation with very little expectation that it's going to pass, but I also understand that by doing that, I'm raising awareness to whatever issues there are that are important to me, I feel, to my district, and you'll find that after a series of years, traction in some cases will start to begin. And it may not be my bill that passes, but the idea that I was trying to put forward may in some form come from perhaps a Democrat or another Republican or the Senate, and it will go into the process and it will become a law. So that's sort of the difference between being in the minority and being in the majority. I don't know if I directly answered your question at all.
Well, so I was looking more for sort of how things flow, but it's an interesting perspective. I will ask a follow-up to your point, which is that as a member of the minority party, things don't pass. But you do have like local bills, right?
Sure,
so there are
sure.
things of local concern, non-controversial.
Absolutely.
I mean, so for one quirk in Rhode Island is if you want to have somebody who's not a minister, bless you, marry you, you have to get a bill passed. So there's hundreds of those every year. Just because you're Republican doesn't mean your constituents can't get married.
Correct. So typically,
So,
those types of bills, solemnization bills as they're called, there's legislation that comes from your towns, maybe in the form of a resolution, maybe something that will impact just one of the towns you represent. And generally, there is no objection among any member of the General Assembly because Shelby may not, or Rep. Maldonado might not agree with the bill that my town is trying to initiate, but knowing that her town may introduce something that I don't agree with, out of respect for our towns, we're not going to tell them how they should govern themselves. So that happens. There's housekeeping stuff like when corporations have gone dormant and need to be reawakened for commerce. These are procedural bills, and absolutely Republicans don't have any issues whatsoever because of that. They are procedural.
okay. But generally speaking, the flow of legislation does reflect that sort of schoolhouse rock picture, right? Which is you come up with an idea, it gets introduced, it goes to a committee. If it's lucky, it comes out of a committee, goes to the floor, goes over to the other side, that sort of thing.
It is, and I think the biggest surprise for me on that whole I'm just a bill sequence was that you can't just put a bill in, no matter how brilliant you may think it is, it's not. It takes time, it takes the eyes of other people, it takes the people on the other side of the issue to rip into it, to make it a good bill. So it doesn't just happen 1, 2, 3, 4. I mean, I'm sure it may on rare occasions, but for the most part, bills have to evolve. So that is a multi-year sometimes process, but that is pretty close to Schoolhouse Rock.
Okay.
And oftentimes, committees will hold hearings on bills, and to get a sense of where the public is, there might be a predetermination on the part of leadership of which direction they want to go. But by having a hearing, the public has a chance to be heard. Bills, we often hear this phrase, held for further study. Sometimes people believe that means a piece of legislation is dead, is not going anywhere. That's not always the case, and public input is really important. I mean, we see the Paw Sox issue right now and how there's a sustained debate about the Paw Sox Stadium. That's because of how the public feels about it. Or, for example, in 2013, advocates for many years have been trying to legalize same-sex marriage in Rhode Island. Teresa Paiva-Weed was the president of the Senate at the time. She was personally opposed to same-sex marriage, but supporters waged a grassroots campaign across the state in which they were knocking on doors, calling people, telling people to call their lawmakers, and due in part to that kind of public pressure, we saw the General Assembly approve same-sex marriage in 2013. Governor Chafee was the governor at the time. He signed that, and that became law. And that shows how public influence is important in politics. But to come back to John's question, the legislative year usually extends from the beginning of January to the end of June. Sometimes it goes on a bit longer. Not a lot happens in the initial House and Senate sessions this time of year. The legislature convenes mostly so lawmakers can introduce their bills. Then there are months of committee hearings, and then by June, more bills start to move to the floor of the House and the Senate. Critics like John Marion would say that one problem is that there are just hundreds of bills that pass the legislature in the final week of the session, and why not have a more deliberate process in which that legislation is considered in a less rushed kind of way?
And I'm glad you raised my points for me.
And I just wanted to add that if you have a bill that you're interested in now is the time to talk to legislators when they have more time. Make an appointment and go up there and express your concerns, especially to your own representative or senator. So this fallow period in the beginning of the session where solemnization bills and congratulatory bills, you read the journals and you think, is this what they're doing? Now is the time to do some background work. And also on the point of bills being sent for further study. There is some tipping point at which the further study commands a second hearing. But there are other times when further study, they say, well, it's just a small change, and so they're only going to hold it for consideration. So there's some frustration in knowing exactly what goes on in the legislative workings. And in that point as well, the bills are sent to legislative counsel, who are lawyers and people familiar with the writing of law, to rewrite these sections. And sometimes if you're an advocate, they don't get the nuance of what you're trying to do. So you have to be very careful that what comes out of legislative counsel is what you're interested in, or what you want.
Yeah, so I think there's some good points in there that I kind of want to lift up about time and the timeline. So the reason we're having this January 20th at the beginning of the year is to give you some sense of what the next 6 months look like if you're interested in following this process and what the various points where you can get involved. So now is the time to start paying attention because they're just starting to meet. They meet Tuesday, Wednesday, and Thursdays, roughly beginning about 4 o'clock, although sometimes they start a little later. And so our next event is about how to testify, and we try to get that in early March because a lot of the hearings that Ian talked about happen in March and April. So roughly from January to February school break is when bills get introduced. When they come back from February school break, because they follow the school calendar, until April school break, they have a lot of hearings. And then from April school break till June is when they move a lot of the legislation through the process. So, Eugenia, when you were, you talked about, going to talk to legislators, but how did you find the bills you were interested in following? There were, of course, bills, I'm sure, that the organization you were working for put in themselves and asked someone to sponsor, but there are probably other bills that affected the environment that you were interested. How did you go about doing that?
Absolutely. So every day I would go through the full list of introductions because I didn't trust what other people's categorization of bills were. And sometimes there would be a bill listed as a tax bill that had some implication for the environment. So I made up my own categories, and I would list every bill that was introduced that had any implication for the environment, environmental education, and government bills that affected the environment. And I would discuss them with my staff, and we would decide which ones merited our attention. But I think you do have to go through with a very fine eye about what bills you might be interested in.
And there's a lot of information on the legislative website. If you click on a link called legislation, there is a row of topics. One is daily introductions for the House and Senate. So you can, in the comfort of your home, you can click on that and see what was introduced last Thursday. You can read through the legislation for yourself and become more informed in that way.
And depending on the topic, a lot of groups will put out a list for the public or for their members of what to follow. So, for instance, the ACLU has a very organized website on which they list bills of interest to the ACLU. I think the Environmental Council of Rhode Island does something similar. We've done something similar in the past. So depending on what the topic is, you don't have to be the person who goes through the 2,000 bills. Have somebody else do it for you because they might be somebody like me who gets paid to go through those bills. I'd like to hear from the representatives a little bit about we heard from the advocate, go see a representative. How do people reach you? Do you talk to people who are your constituents and people who aren't your constituents and so forth?
So for me, I have a pretty good relationship with my mayor in Central Falls, so his staff is really great in keeping me up to speed. Throughout the year, we're sort of looking at what policies would strengthen the community as far as policies are in the budget. So we have that dialogue going on, which is helpful for our constituents because we're meeting their need. Aside from that, as far as statewide issues on that level, it's my responsibility as well as the advocate to have built that relationship to exchange information about what we want to see as policies in the state of Rhode Island. It's a part-time job, so to keep that in mind. Our role in the General Assembly is part-time. Ian touched on the basis of January to June is when we're really heavily up there. And then the off-season is where we're still continuing our conversations with our elected officials as far as our constituents. But as far as getting our work done at a part-time level, like for myself, I work full-time, so I'm meeting my 40 hours a week. I am not in any shape or form making the $1 million to have that flexibility to do this a full-time position. But I do it out of compassion, out of the love of the work, and the number of representatives are up there doing the same. So, but we are very accessible. We do have a secretary that monitors our emails. We make sure our secretaries are up to speed with constituent needs, or if there's a policy we're working on, we want to make sure that those advocates are being heard. We also have the groups that we are working with. They do provide us with staff, which is very helpful on that part. If you are an organization advocating on a certain policy, they will be able to allocate some staff to us to be able to assist us through giving us research, giving us talking points. We do have, not only are we accessible through our secretary emails, but we also have our cell phones out. I'm pretty good at my response to my phone calls, and people will call and share their opinions, and we'll take them in and then vet that out through the process of our time up in the legislative office. But as far as our accessibility, I would say it's very open. For myself, I think for a few others, a number of us up there, we do have Facebook pages. Social media has played a huge role today. We have Twitter accounts. We're pretty active on our Twitter accounts, our Facebook accounts. So you have that method as well to reach out to ourselves. But yeah, I don't know if Rep, you want to add anything?
Sure. Well, first I just want to state that I'm extremely jealous of the fact that Rep Maldonado has a 1 square mile district. Because my district runs from the southern border of Burrillville all the way down to the northern border of West Greenwich, 37% of the western border of Rhode Island. So what that does, it doesn't give me more constituents. It actually just spreads them out more. So for a guy like me, I do the same thing as far as making myself available. You have to have a website, you have to have the social media, and when I say you have to, you really do. I mean, I would prefer not to be doing Twitter and Facebook, but it's a requirement. You have to make yourself available. I don't know of a single rep who doesn't have a dedicated cell phone for their constituents. We all do take slightly different approaches. In my approach is that I don't allow anyone to speak to my constituents except for me. So if they call my office at the State House, I always have them give them my personal phone number so they can speak with me. It's not to say that I don't rely on staff to help execute whatever it is that constituent issue was, but I just personally like that because I get to meet more people, I get to know them, and they actually get to know me and what I can and can't do to help them. But I think the most important part about that, and this does dovetail with what Ms. Marks said, you have to communicate to your senator and to your rep, even if it's only to say no on that one and yes on that one, or if it's to send them 16 very scientific articles to support your position. We do value that. I don't consider 100 emails on the same topic harassment. I consider it great because it helps me understand a perspective that's other than my own, which I think makes for a more educated and a better vote.
Can you both speak a little bit? You mentioned staff. Do you have individual offices? Do you have what's your staff look like? I know it differs because one's in the majority and one's in the minority.
Yeah, I think that's the biggest difference. So very briefly, the minority, again, there's 11 out of 75 Republicans. So we have an office which consists of 4 rooms. Except for the leadership of our caucus, we don't have offices to ourselves. We have desks where we hang our hats and keep our stuff. We have shared staff. We have 4 full-time and 1 part-time staff in our office, and that's who we deal with. And I will let Shelby explain that.
I think it's pretty similar for us on the Democratic side as well. We share our offices, there's a desk, there may be several of us in one room sharing different desks. We each share a secretary. Our secretaries sometimes have 4 representatives they're serving. And then we just have ledge research that allows us to go to them and feed different ideas coming from the public, our constituents. They'll draft legislation for us. Then there's also the policy staff that allows us to sort of have a conversation or a dialogue about how this may or may not affect or what's realistic and not realistic within this, within the basis that we're working in. But aside from that, like I mentioned, it is a part-time position, and to be honest, I'll speak for myself. I won't speak for any other rep, but it is when you come into the seat, and I didn't know coming in, to be honest. It was my first time. I was about 26 years old when I came into the General Assembly, and it's true. I thought I knew everything, and that was not. And so you just, through that staff, you sometimes on your own as a representative have to take initiatives, and we do that a lot. I think we take initiatives on our own to do times 10. And if we do have a great organization working with us on a policy, that's why it's so key for representatives. If you want to see in a rep, and your rep's passionate about that, to assist them is being present in the room with them, sharing, being in contact consistently with us, because we're sort of lifting tremendous amount of work, and it is, again, a part-time. So we want to make sure we're meeting the needs by the time of June.
But then there's the committee hierarchy, and committee chairs have more staff devoted to their particular topic and wield obviously more power.
Yeah, and so one of the things that surprised me when I started working in Rhode Island about a decade ago was that they share staff, that you don't have a dedicated staff the way a member of Congress would, or even in Massachusetts, if you're a state legislator, you're going to have a staff. You have an allocation of money to hire people. You'll have a chief of staff and even other staff members. It's all shared. It's very, very much part-time. And the allocation of resources comes from down on high. So it's not, you don't get to hire people. They're hired for you to access.
But
So
then to the representatives, each representative made a remark about information. So to the extent that you are able to bring data of one sort or another to the attention of a legislator, that's very helpful because they do not have research staff.
Yeah. One thing I forget, I remember the first night I testified, I introduced myself as the new guy from Common Cause, and they said, "Oh, you're a group with facts." And I was like, "Are there groups that come up here without facts?" And I've realized over the years that, yeah, there are groups that come up without facts. But did you have a point? Sorry.
I guess for my experience with Legislative Council, Ledge Research, I've often given them an idea, documents, data, and they would feed back to me where their recommendations are, how this could fit. But you are correct that as far as the deep research that an organization can do, it's quite difficult to find. And so that's why it's so key for us, wanting to be effective, to be able to have that dialogue. Because the organization or entity is truly providing us with the data and research that we can articulate and put through to the remaining body of the committee, which the body ultimately is making that decision with their chairperson of that committee to determine whether that policy should be moved forward or not.
And I think it's important to note on the Republican side, we have 2 dedicated policy analysts in our office. They work, they work specifically for us. They're not in a pool that people will go to. So I consider it an advantage to be able to walk into my office and have a conversation with an individual with whom I have a relationship. I know them, I talk to them every day, they've worked on projects, they kind of know where I'm coming from, politically speaking. And so it went from when I first got there saying, all right, I want a bill that's going to stop the DMV from harassing my constituents, and that's all I knew. And then the legal people and the research analysts would take it and turn it into something. Then you kind of evolve to thinking you know how to write your own legislation, so you start, therefore, pursuant to and all that. And then you realize that doesn't work. Then you get to a point where, again, the research staff knows where you're coming from in most cases, and you can say, look, I want to address this, and I just need information on it, and you get the information.
So Ian, this is all, you said you've been doing this for quite some time, in that you pay attention to certain things but not to other things, or you try to sort of lift up some things that maybe other people aren't paying attention to. Like what, as a member of the press, what can you observe? Like what parts of the process are you allowed to observe? What parts of the process aren't you allowed to observe?
That's a great question, and the legislature, as we've heard, meets Tuesday to Thursday, usually starting at 4. Anyone can go up to the State House and sit in the gallery and watch the process. Often, I will admit I am a big political nerd, even if I might be covering a different kind of political story. When I come home, I will turn on Capitol TV and watch repeats of legislative meetings, and my wife thinks I'm absolutely crazy. But it depends what's going on. It depends where the action is. There are a number of important political stories in Rhode Island on a given day. Some of them at the legislature, it might be in Warwick, it might be at the governor's office, it might be something having to do with Senator Reid or White House or Congressman Cicilline. So there's a lot going on. And the number of reporters covering Rhode Island is probably down quite a bit from what it once was. So I have to prioritize what is important. There are times when very important things are happening at the State House, like we had the governor's State of the State address this week. That's important. The introduction of the budget, that's important. Committee hearings on key pieces of legislation, that is important. And you can go to the legislative website, and in recent years, there's been a greatly enhanced capacity archive of video of legislative meetings, which is a great resource because you can go back and look up a legislative debate. But I also, for example, I did a story a couple of years ago. I became aware that Attorney General Peter Kilmartin was the main force behind a piece of legislation banning investment by Rhode Island-based entities in the nation of Iran. And, Iran has been a controversial player on the international scene. I found out that this piece of legislation that was touted as a big thing actually had no consequence. It had no direct impact, and it was arguably just kind of a feel-good thing for Attorney General Peter Kilmartin. So I did a story on that, and that's what it's a balance between sometimes covering the news of the day versus pulling back and taking a look at something that might be unknown but is less of an acute issue. So I don't know if I've answered your question, John.
A little bit. I'll refine it a little. So this week, the Paw Sox were in the news for a couple of reasons, and one of them was because the House Democrats had a caucus, and they talked about the Paw Sox legislation. Were you able to go into that caucus and watch what happened? And if not, why not?
That was a closed caucus only for Democrats, meaning that Rep. Chippendale could not be there because he's a Republican. If I wanted to be inside that caucus, I could not, because the Speaker has the ability to call a closed meeting. Sometimes legislative leaders call caucuses that are open to the media, but they have a lot of discretion in this matter. Usually they will talk with reporters afterwards and talk in some to some degree about what happened in the meeting, but you were not in there, so you don't know if that's 100% accurate. You might not be able, I've been covering Rhode Island for a long time, so I have a lot of sources. I feel like I have a pretty good pulse on what's happening, but there's a difference between being able to be inside a meeting where you hear the candid things that are being said and then hearing a filtered version of it afterwards.
Yeah, and so one of the unique things about a state where one party has such an overwhelming majority is that you can have a private meeting of the party, but it's enough people to decide the issue. So the other big example is the Providence City Council has 15 members, all of whom are Democrats. They can call a caucus, and it's the entire city council. But that's sort of more a symptom of the fact that one party is dominant in the state. And so you'll see some press around, well, and I'll get phone calls, why isn't the public allowed in there? Well, a party is a private entity.
John, on that, if I might interject, and I'm going to, oddly enough, defend the Democrats on this point. A lot of folks were, this big secret meeting and everyone's getting upset and, they're going to decide, well, yeah, Republicans do it all the time. It's just that there's 11 of us and we can't change anything, so no one cares that we met in secret.
Yeah. So you meet in a phone booth.
You're right. When you have a large, in fact, a quorum, you have more than a quorum of the House when the Democrats caucus. But that's how the leadership of that party gets a pulse on where are my members. So I don't think there's anything inherently nefarious about meeting privately and secretively. And it wasn't even secretively. That was just a word that was tossed around social media about the meeting. It's perfectly normal. It's part of the process. I don't think there's anything bad about it.
Yeah.
And also, every year there are always a couple of thorny issues at the end of the legislative session that some of them related to the budget, and oftentimes there can be a difference of opinion between the House and Senate leadership. And there are closed meetings where the Speaker and the Senate President might talk about these things and hash out these things. And, these reporters like me are not privy to those meetings, but we follow up and try and follow the issue as best we can. And that's been true of politics for forever.
So, Eugenia, we talked a little bit and we heard a little bit about sort of the flow of legislation up there, but speaking from the advocate's perspective, what sorts of things do you do to try to get the legislation you were supporting to advance, right? Because things get introduced, lots of things, everything gets a hearing, but then there's this held for further study. And very few things then come back after they're held for further study. What sorts of things did you do to try to convince the legislature to not hold things forever?
Well, first of all, working in coalitions, not just as a single voice. That's very helpful because there are different points of view within an issue. Secondly, looking at who the key legislators are for that piece of legislation and trying to arrange meetings with them to explain the underpinnings of the amendment that's being offered. Obviously, public opinion, letters to the editor, editorials, ways of getting the issue in the public mind, and hoping that that will also influence the officials' minds, and presenting further evidence, trying to find key articles that will be pertinent, not reams of paper, but trying to distill it into some small bite that has a good reference to it. Those are some of the ways. Mm-hmm. And trying to figure out, well, one thing that hasn't been mentioned, and because I've been out of the loop for a couple of years, is the user's handbook still being published? And
yes.
So
yes.
Yes. So in your wonderful maps, you did not include a map of the basement.
Yeah.
And in room 35, is it?
38.
38.
Yes.
is the Secretary of State's office, where you can find a user's handbook. And it gives a bio and a picture of each legislator. So that helps in identifying people up in the hallways and meeting with them on these issues. And also, what are their interests? So that you can fashion your argument to things that they are interested in.
Yeah, that's great advice. If I can build on it.
One second.
Yeah.
You can also find that information online. If you Google Rhode Island Government Users Manual, you can pull it up online.
Sometimes, though, it's nice to have that book because people mark them up. And the other place you can get it is the state library. So if you go into the building, that big, majestic library has the manual, which are free. It's a big book about more than just the legislature, about every city and town, about the courts and so forth. They also have a floor map of each chamber as a seating chart like you would see, in the 5th grade. And they, so that when you go on to the floor, and one of the things we haven't talked about is before they start for the day, citizens can go onto the floor. So there will be these doormen standing at the door, and they'll kind of look at you, and you just walk right past them. Until the gavel has struck and they've begun the session, you have the right to go on the floor. And a lot of people don't know that the first time they go up there. You don't have to watch from the gallery at that point. You can go out there. And it helps to have these seating charts where you can say, okay, I know her seat is over to the left. I'm going to go try to find her. You kind of stake them out and wait for them to show up by their seat. And that can be really helpful. I know that owner's manual, I have a lot of dog-eared copies of that in my office.
It's great to collect them because you look at the old like Rep. Chippendale's picture from 2010 is a classic.
And I still use it.
And it has contact information, so many of you put your cell phone number in
And
there.
John, I'm sure you've seen the new 7-foot-tall iPad in the library that has all of that functionality, including a map too. I thought it was great. I
I
checked
forgot.
it out the other day.
So our Secretary of State's doing a good job at public outreach in trying to open things up. So she has a big, huge,
It's as big as that, bro.
touch screen that you can use in the state. It's like a self-serve kiosk for the legislature. So I haven't played with it yet, but
Yeah.
it
You can find the bills, everything you can find, all the functionality that you have in Bill Tracker and all that is on there. You can go through your senators, reps. You can find a map. How do I get from here to here? It's fantastic.
That's
I think
great.
it's outstanding. Yeah.
So that's artificial intelligence taking our jobs. So we could have just put that on stage and let you play with it for an hour. So Shelby, I'm going to ask you what I think is probably one of the pivotal questions, also a difficult question to answer in some ways, which is how do bills get votes, right? So there's this kind of funnel, and there's roughly 2,000 bills a year, and a couple of hundred of them get votes. How are those decisions made? We've heard a little bits and pieces about it.
Yeah, I mean, ultimately, in my work, Align, I think it's the best way I can explain it. So there's a piece of policy or legislation. It will be introduced, so I will draft it, bring it to the floor as new business. It will then be given a number. Then the speaker, which is, will determine based on its subject matter which committee it will go towards. Once that is put to the committee, what will happen is I'll prepare my points, have my groups together, my advocates prepared for testimony, give them a head notice about when that bill will be heard in committee, which will allow us to prepare for testimony. Once that piece of legislation is in a committee, for example, then it's being heard for consideration, Then what will happen is I'll come up, I'll testify, my advocates will come up and testify in support. We'll hear some opposition if it's there. And then what will happen is they will hold it for further study. Essentially what will happen at that point is my responsibility along with the parties that I'm working with is to speak with the chairman of that committee, to speak with the members of the committee, make changes where based on public opinion where those changes need to be. Essentially, what you would hope is that through having having conversations, having lobbying on the issue, that we would then see the changes, and then the chair of the committee will then reintroduce, bring the bill to committee for a vote. Based on the committee's decision, what you will see then is if there's a resolution for a sub-A, an amendment to be made, that's the point where we'll see it at the second hearing. Then at that point, they will vote on the legislation to be moved to the floor for a larger vote. Once that takes place, if things are working great for Rep. Maldonado, it will come onto the floor. And then what will happen is it will be brought to the calendar, so you'll see it on the calendar on the website, state website. It'll have a policy, a ledge number, a house number. What will happen is that would also have like a small synap of what the policy is about. So all parties that are not aware of this policy that's about to come to the floor, they will be able to briefly look at what they're looking at and begin to read line by line if they recognize some changes. They may have an amendment to the policy on the floor at that point. An amendment, you can, for example, I can introduce something and then Representative Chippendale may say, I have an amendment to this policy on line such and such, and raise his concerns. At that point, the larger body, now before on the House floor, is looking at this and saying, does the amendment make sense? The attorneys are looking through this, and essentially they can vote that down or vote green for it. If they vote down for it, they say, Representative Chippendale, great point, but it's not sufficient enough to make it a change on the legislation. Therefore, we'll vote on it. The committee will vote either down or for it. And then if they vote down for it, then my policy originally, as I've worked on this over the past several months and have put a lot of work, is going to be voted on. At that point, and I'll give you the insight, if I'm somebody that's on a heavy issue and I know there's going to be some amendments, I'm doing my due diligence to talk to my leaders of leadership. So I'm making sure I'm talking to the whip, his role is to make sure the votes are there. I'm talking to my chair of committee to make sure his arguments are prepared to counter those arguments. I'm making sure there's other representatives on the floor who support the policy, having their arguments prepared. Essentially, once that great policy Rep. Maldonado put through, we voted on, and if it passes, then essentially what will happen is it will be married on the Senate side. And then we'll make sure the Senate, because there's two bills, I know we haven't touched on that, but there's a MERA bill on the Senate side. It'll pass through, and then it goes to the governor's desk for signature, and then it becomes a policy or a law in the state of Rhode Island. I wonder if that was the answer to that question.
Yeah, well, so.
I gave a little bit, maybe.
Yeah, and you had some really important points in there. One is that there's 99% of the time there's two versions of a bill.
Correct.
And for no legal reason other than 20 years ago, people started putting in two versions of a bill, one from the Senate, one from the House. Only one needs to pass, but almost all the time they both make it through. A lot of it, I think, has to do with credit claiming, so that, each chamber passed a bill on the topic.
John, but I will add to her remark that it as an advocate, you do want to have a Senate,
Yes.
your best to have a Senate merit, because it does give some power to it. It does give a little bit of a push. Often the question asked of myself, and I'm sure a number of reps, is there a Senate sponsor? Is this being discussed on the Senate side? Because what essentially you want is, you don't want to have a strong argument on one side of the building, and it's like, great, we understand, and then they be so oblivious or not aware of what's happening, and then they have a policy in front of them that may be controversial, and they're like, well, what is this? We want to make sure that each party, the Senate and the House, are vetting out this policy thoroughly, so that when it does come for a floor vote, which is all of everybody, both Republicans and Democrats, there's a sense in the room that this is a policy we need to push forward on, even when the opposition comes through, because we've vetted it through committee, we've had meetings, the advocates have had meetings with the representatives, has had meetings with leadership if their ability allows them to do so, and then that gives some power. So it is key to make sure you do have a House and a Senate sponsor, so that it has some leeway. But it also, the House policy could just come to the Senate without no sponsor, have a Senate vote, and then come back for another vote on the House, and then move into the governor's desk. So you not necessarily by fact need a Senate sponsor for that.
And then you touched on amendments. You do a lot of amendments. The minority party tends to do a lot of amendments on the floor because that's how you can make your points.
Yes, absolutely. So because a Republican initiative will not necessarily come to the floor for a vote and or discussion, we will, when appropriate, offer amendments. We'll look at a proposal, whether it's the budget, and offer several amendments, perhaps dozens, or a particular piece of legislation. We will write amendments. The disadvantage we have as Republicans is that the majority party controls everything that happens in that building. And to quote a famous former rep, even the air we breathe is controlled by the Democrats. So what happens is on budget night and crazy night, which is when 160 bills pass in the span of about 12 hours, we have a ton of God bless you. We have a ton of amendments ready, and because the Democrats control the lawyers who are writing our amendments, they consequently have access to our amendments. Therefore, they have the ability to study for and assign different snipers to our amendments. So it's almost comically predictive that when I stand up, is it either going to be Rep A or Rep B that destroys my amendment? You know, we laugh about it because we can, but that's an unfortunate part of such a heavy one-party rule.
So most of your amendments do not pass, it's safe to say.
It's safe to say that most of our amendments don't pass, and it's also safe to say that we have absolutely no expectation that they'll pass, but we're using them as a soapbox for us to offer legitimately through the process an opposing viewpoint to what is about to happen.
And there's a lot of value in this soapbox because the reporters like myself will report on the arguments that are waged by Republicans, even if they are voted down by overwhelming margins. And I remember being, hearing how the former Republican leader in the House, Robert Watson, he's had some legal troubles in recent years, but he was very prescient in talking about the bill that was ultimately used to fund 38 studios that passed in 2010. The legislation was not directly for 38 studios. It was just described as a job development fund. He was the only lawmaker to vote against it in the final iteration, and he warned that it was a scandal in the making, and that, the audio and the video of that lives, and that's a valuable piece of history.
But it's not only Republicans who offer amendments. So last year we did this panel with Maria Samini, who was a former state representative, a Democrat, and she would, on budget night, offer an amendment to raise the top marginal tax rate. So it was it was a progressive amendment aimed at her own party's majority. So I don't want to leave with the impression that it's just, just Republicans offering amendments to try to poke holes in bills of Democrats. Sometimes Democrats are poking holes at their own bills.
Yeah, those can be some of the most spirited debates in the budget process.
Yeah, and there's we talked a lot about the budget process. That is probably the biggest debate of the year. So, if you watch this sort of Mr. Smith Goes to Washington and you're thinking that there's a lot of debate, some nights there is, some nights there isn't. Some nights it's just these marriage bills and they're quick. But on budget night, you're usually guaranteed a few hours of somewhat spirited debate. Yes. Yeah. Oh, so the term the question was to repeat the term, and you referred to it as a mirror bill?
No.
Or
I think it was the marriage bill she's asking.
Oh, so there's a couple terms. One is, I know Rep. Maldonado referred to a mirror bill, so that there was a Senate version of a bill that the House had. So they sometimes call them companion bills. They're identical bills in each chamber. The other was a marriage bill. So these are the bills that are required to allow somebody besides a minister to marry a couple. Mirror. Like looking in the mirror and there's an identical version. So.
And I think it's interesting to just point out on that, and just in this past session, there was a bill that was introduced in the House, and it was probably the most common sense bill and easiest bill to vote for that I've seen in my 8 years up there. It was eliminating a ridiculous regulation, and it passed through the House without even a hiccup. But it died in the Senate and was openly stated it died because no one on the Senate side was allowed to take credit for it. That's unfortunate. That happens. That's why the companions have to, as a matter of practicality, be introduced.
So, so those are some of the things you're not going to see in sort of, I'm just a bill, right? Those are the norms of the building, and I hope we've sort of pulled some of those out. I want to throw it open. If anybody has a question, you can shout it at me, and I'll repeat it into the microphone. Yes, sir.
When a bill comes out of committee, what kind of effort is made? Whose responsibility is it to see that all the other legislators know what's there?
So when a bill comes out of committee, whose responsibility is it to make sure that all the other legislators know what's in it and what it's about?
Traditionally, there's a leadership position called a whip, and very much like the term, their job is to whip up support for an initiative. So if something comes out of committee, that means it passed. I don't think I have seen a bill come out of committee and not pass on the floor of whatever chamber it came out of the committee from. So the whip of each party will most frequently be the person responsible for gathering support.
And they'll have a list. You'll see them walk around the room with a list, checking off to make sure that they know where people are on a bill. And his name is Jay Edwards, the current whip. And I've seen Jay say, we really need you. Like, lean into somebody, and we really need you on this vote. And grab them by the arm.
That doesn't say they know what's in it. They're voting for it for political reasons, maybe sometimes.
Do
I mean,
people
So,
vote
I
on
mean,
things they don't?
So again, it goes back on the representative, the sponsor of that bill. It's our due diligence to ensure that the committee is aware of what the policy is. They've vetted it, they've looked at it, the policy's in front of them. The next step is, my role is to ensure that the whip or any of the parties in leadership are aware of how important this policy is. And they're gonna question that. A policy doesn't just come in January and then I get it through in January. I can introduce something in January and it won't go through to the end of May. So through those months, I'm talking about it. The advocates on the floor, the legislators on the floor, sometimes are not aware of what they're looking at until it comes on the calendar. And someone in there could be telling them, you have to come, we need you on this vote. They can or not and hold off until they read the policy, which likely we would hope they're doing. And they're looking at the policy and saying no or yes, or these are my questions. Can you answer them because I'm raising them now? But essentially, when we're pushing something, it's the due diligence of the whip as well to be giving, as he's leaning in, we would hope that he's informing them of exactly what that policy is allowing the state to do.
I'd like to add something on that briefly. I think there are a number of lawmakers who are very diligent, and I would put the two lawmakers to my right in that category, but there are some lawmakers who pay less attention. Every bill has a very brief summary at the end of it that's usually 1, 2, 3 sentences, and there might be some lawmakers who just read that, if at all. Right. And I'll tell you a story that's both a little funny and a little bit sad. This job development bill that was ultimately used to fund 38 studios had three co-sponsors. It was sponsored by Stephen Costantino, who was then the House Finance Chairman, a very powerful position. It was also sponsored by John Breen, a conservative Democrat from Woonsocket, no longer in the legislature, and Helio Mello, no longer in the legislature, a rep from East Providence. And Stephen Costantino came back to the State House about a year or two ago to speak during an oversight hearing on how 38 Studios happened. And he was asked, he spoke about how Helio Mello signed on as a co-sponsor of this bill that was ultimately used to fund 38 Studios. And it was no more complicated than the fact that Helio Mello happened to sit next to Stephen Costantino in the House chamber, and Costantino just said, would you sign on to my bill? And that's sometimes the way things happen.
And to the problem of passing multiple bills in one segment of the legislature. Many of the bills are 30, 40, 60 pages long, and they're amendments, so they come with cross-out for what's being deleted and underlined for what's being added. And it's really unfair to expect the legislator is going to read, it's not unfair, but it's a crazy system that a legislator is expected to read multiple bills of this length and complexity. So I think there's something in the system that we need to work on as well.
Yeah, and we talk as an organization a lot about, as Ian mentioned at the beginning, the fact that the process has its flaws. And one of the biggest flaws is that too much is left till the end. So there's a moment toward the end where they suspend certain rules of public notice and so forth so that they can take up a lot of legislation in a short period of time. And it is I would say it's an unrealistic expectation for a representative, no matter how diligent they are, to be able to read. So in some ways, by doing this, they're putting the public in a bad position, but they're also putting their own members in a bad position. I know we have a ton of hands up, so I'm going to try to do a few more questions.
I have a question as a person in the public who would like to express an opinion. What is the best way? Is it better to write a letter? Is it better to phone? Is it better to sign a petition? Is it better to...
Yeah, that's a great question. So what's the best way to make your voice heard to you? Petition, phone call, email, letter?
To me, the most effective is a handwritten letter. Second to that would be a typed letter. Third to that would be a personal phone call. Fourth to that would be a personally written email. And then petitions are very, very low on the scale, unless they come with organizational support. So if there's an organization to promote an issue and say, look, we've got 30,000 Rhode Islanders, that makes a difference than someone just running around and getting signatures for who knows what. So the more personal the interaction, the more gravity I place on it, and the more likelihood you're going to get a lot of my time talking.
And if you do a petition, and the signatures on that, sorry about that, thought I was loud enough. If it is a petition, if the signatures on there from the constituents of that representative or senator, that it would be effective, because you have now the constituents of more than 30 people who probably vote or support that senator or rep. That would play an effective role in gaining the attention of that person to really recognize the issue that you're proposing.
That's a great question. Yes.
What are the powers of the Speaker of the House?
Yeah, what are the powers of the Speaker of the House? That's kind of a big question. I have an answer.
Representative.
Do you want me to? I mean, I'll say, Rhode Island, every legislature leadership has more power than rank and file. In Rhode Island, from my look at it, the speaker has more power than any other speaker in the country. And that's has a lot to do with our history. Constitutionally, we have a very strong legislature, really the strongest in the country compared to the governor, and also a very centralized legislature. So there was a dust-up last week about even the Senate president was trying to hire someone, and the speaker wouldn't let the Senate president, the the presiding officer of the other chamber, hire a staff member because he has so much control over the budget and as well as over the flow of legislation.
And there's an obscure body called the Joint Committee on Legislative Services, JCLS. You might hear those letters used sometimes. That is the hiring and spending arm of the legislature. It's there's, in theory, a 5-person panel that controls it. The speaker controls 3 of those seats versus 2 by the Senate president. So the speaker has effective control of hiring and spending at the State House. And if someone, you sometimes hear about lawmakers being put into Siberia. If leadership is angry at them, they can have their premium State House parking spot taken away. Sometimes petty things like that happen. So the speaker has a great amount of control over the process.
Yes, sir.
Is the ethics committee going to set up a bill to stop holding people
So the question's about the ethics committee or commission? Commission. So I can field that one. So in 2009, there was a Supreme Court case, the Rhode Island Supreme Court right next door, that took away the Ethics Commission's oversight of the legislators. That was restored in 2016. So right now, yes, if one of these representatives has a conflict of interest as defined in the law, they can be prosecuted by the State Ethics Commission.
So I guess what my big question is, in regards to what Tansy said, that she was sexually harassed. Is the ethics committee gonna look into that?
Yeah, so the question's about the charges of sexual harassment by Representative Teresa Tansey. The Ethics Commission actually doesn't have jurisdiction over a person, their jurisdiction's over conflicts of interest. So if you vote on a bill to give a contract to a business you own, they'll get you. But sexual harassment falls under something called the Human Rights Commission, the State Human Rights Commission. And I believe you have to file a complaint with them. They can't just go out and do something because they heard about it in the news.
And you also need to remember that Representative Tansey has declined to identify the person who she says harassed her. It is her position that it's more productive to try and focus on the issue of sexual harassment as looking at it as a systemic issue. She is expected to lead a panel or commission looking at this going forward, and that is the path that she has chosen to take.
But I'm glad you brought it up. That is a big issue at the Assembly this year that I've seen. They had some training on sexual harassment in the House recently, and there's been a lot of talk about that, and we hadn't covered it, so thank you. How about we do one more, and then we promise to let people go a little early to go to the march. Yes?
Is there a date by which legislation has to be introduced, and what is that date?
So is there a date by which legislation has to be introduced, and what is it?
That's a,
Yes,
School
but there's
break.
an exception.
There is an exception, but it is prior to the school break in February that we have a
Yeah,
deadline.
so it's usually, I think, the second week in February,
Something
by the
around
end
that
of the
time.
second week in February. I can say there is an exception, it's called a Rule 7D.
7D. But that's just in the House, it's important to note.
Yeah, they're very liberal in allowing things after that date in the House. In the Senate, they've been much stricter. Former Senate President Teresa Paiva-Weed used to even impose a 5-bill limit on senators. So the House, I think most members of the House can get something introduced well into the session.
But it's my understanding also that committee chairs have permission to introduce bills at later dates. Is that correct?
It may be, I'm not aware of a specific rule that articulates that.
Yeah, I don't think that's in the official rules.
So I think,
Right.
what it may be is we have Rule 7D, which says after the deadline, any legislator, with the consent of the majority leader and the leadership, can introduce a bill, up to 3 bills. After that, we still can, but we have to do it specifically with the permission of the Speaker of the House. So I think maybe committee chairs are probably given a little bit more deferential treatment and allowed perhaps to introduce after that.
But another good example of how some arcane rules grant the speaker a particular amount of power, right? So it's with the speaker's permission that after certain deadlines you can introduce things, and you will see things introduced on the last day. If the leadership wants it to happen, it will happen. But all great questions. Thank you very much. I just want to once again thank all the panelists for all their time and wisdom.
Our pleasure.
And I want to thank you all for coming out on a Saturday morning. As I mentioned, we got Bolt Coffee upstairs, donated some coffee, so that should be out in the hallway, so you can take that on your way out. And please join us for the other events if you like. Thanks.
yeah, nice job. Good to see you. What are your priorities for this year?
Thanks, John. Great, I could have done it all day, as you know, I'm a
Yep.
talker.
And then, John, thank you so much. This is great.
Nice job, John.
Good. So we have that introducing wage tax bill for the past 2 years. And then there's city ask, and then there's
Sure. Are you for the Paul Sox bill? Yeah, sure. Yeah.
Pawtucket is one of the most stressed cities in the state of Maine. Potentially using that conversation about that. But above that, we need to think about how to invest.
Thank you for coming.